looking at another example of solving a quadratic equation. When you are solving a quadratic equation, typically what you will do is move everything to the left-hand side and just have 0 by itself on the right. Okay. So let's do that. So we need to subtract x from each side, and we need to subtract 9 from each side. So I have 2x squared minus 2x minus 6 equals 0. Now, is there anything that they have in common? They're all divisible by 2. So we can divide everything by 2. X squared minus x minus 3. Okay. Now, typically what I would do if this was just a problem that you were given to solve, it didn't give you any method, it just said solve this. This is what I would do. I would get everything to one side. I would see if I could factor out any numbers, make them smaller. Then I would look at x squared minus x minus 3 and see if that is something that I can factor. So off to the side or in my head, I'm thinking, okay, what numbers multiply to negative 3? 1 and 3. And is there a way to add 1 and 3 and end up with negative 1? There's not. Okay, if we added those, we would end up with negative 2, not negative 1. So we can't factor it. So I'm going to work on completing the square. Now, when we go to the completing the square method, we're actually going to end up moving that 3 to the other side. So you might think, well, why did we move it over then? Just because I wanted to see if it would factor. Okay. So we're going to move the 3 to the other side. And remember, we leave a space when we're going to complete the square. So we have x squared minus x, some number, equals 3, some number. And the way that we find that number is we look at the number in front of x. The number in front of x is a negative 1. Okay. I know there's not actually a number there, but there's a minus, and since there's an x there, there has to be a 1. We divide that number by 2. So we get negative 1/2, and then we square that, which gives us 1/4. Because 1 squared is 1 and 2 squared is 4. So I'm going to be adding 1/4 to each side. So now I can factor the left-hand side into x minus 1/2 equals 3 plus 1/4. So 3 and 1/4, but we want to write that as an improper fraction. So 3 times 4 is 12, plus 1 is 13. So I get 13/4. Since it is a squared, we take the square root. So x minus 1/2 equals positive or negative. I can't take the square root of 13, but the square root of 4 is 2. To get x by itself, we would add 1/2, right? So our answers would be 1/2 plus the square root of 13 over 2. And 1/2 minus the square root of 13 over 2. Or you could write it as 1 plus or minus the square root of 13 all over 2, if you want. There's a couple different ways to write that, but so we can solve any quadratic equation using this method of completing the square. I'm not sure that it's the most convenient method of solving a quadratic equation, but it does work. So writing a function into or changing it into vertex form is very similar to solving an equation by completing the square, except we don't have it set equal to 0. So we can't just divide and get rid of numbers. Okay. We can factor things out, but they are still going to stay there and exist there. So it's a little bit different when we start doing, or when we look at vertex form versus solving an equation. We start out in a similar situation, but we don't want to get everything equal to 0 because we have that y in there. Okay, so this is set up a little bit differently. What we're going to do is we're still going to leave that space to figure out what number do we need to complete the square right there. But because I'm not solving this, I can't just move the 6 to the other side, so that's going to stay there. So what I'm going to end up doing is adding a number right here. And since I can't just add it to the other side because I'm not solving the equation, I'm going to subtract it over here. So I'm going to add a number in and I'm going to subtract a number out. Keep it all even. Okay. And so I recommend setting it up like that so you kind of have your remembering what we're doing. Look at your number in front of x, divide it in half. We get 2, square that, we get 4. So I'm going to add 4 there on the first blank, and I'm going to subtract 4 on the second blank. So now I can rewrite x squared plus 4x plus 4 will factor into what two numbers multiply to 4 and add to 4? Two and 2, right? So y equals x plus 2 quantity squared minus 10. Who can tell me what the vertex of this parabola would be? So the vertex, it's just the opposite of that number inside there. So once we have this in vertex form, we can quickly identify that the vertex is at -2, -10. The number in front of x squared is positive, so it's going to open upward. The y-intercept would be -6. And then we could sketch a graph real quick. Okay.